Jackson lingered by the door, his suitcase already in hand. He turned to face me, wearing that familiar expression I knew all too well. It was serious, slightly anxious, yet tinged with a hint of excitement, as if he were about to suggest something truly significant. After 10 years of marriage, I could read his face like a book, but his words still took me by surprise. "Sophie," he started, speaking carefully as if gauging my reaction. "I'd like you to accompany me to London." I froze at the mention of London, the city I had often dreamed about but never expected to visit anytime soon. Thoughts swirled in my mind like a butterfly trapped in a web. London, with its historic streets, iconic bridges, and foggy parks, seemed like a place where one could escape reality and begin anew. However, this trip wasn't about us or my aspirations. It was just another business trip for Jackson, another crucial meeting. I realized he was asking me more out of obligation than from a genuine desire to share time together. A wave of mild irritation, bordering on resentment, washed over me. Jackson had always been driven, endlessly focused on his projects and career. I respected his ambition. His world was full of goals. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of growing distance, as if I were standing on a shore while he drifted further out to sea, entranced by his own aspirations. "I don't know, Jackson," I replied, my voice fading as if I were losing faith in my own words. "Why not?" He looked at me, a hint of disappointment in his eyes, though his expression remained gentle. "It's just for a few days. I thought you'd be excited to see London." I sighed, attempting to gather my thoughts. Of course, I wanted to experience London, but not under these circumstances. I didn't want to be merely an accessory at his important event, like a decorative element in his life. I craved a genuine getaway where we could be ourselves, free from his relentless meetings and phone calls. "It's not the right time," I finally said. "I need to take care of some things here." That was a lie. Deep down, I knew it wasn't about the tasks awaiting me. It was about us, the growing distance I had been sensing more acutely lately. Jackson scrutinized me closely, as if trying to decipher my thoughts, but I maintained my composure. "All right," he finally said, managing a tense smile. "I understand." I nodded, feeling an invisible weight pulling me down like a stone sinking to the bottom of a river. He turned to leave, and I watched him walk away, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over me, as if I had just let go of something significant. Once he was gone, I found myself alone with my thoughts, a rising sense of emptiness enveloping me. For the first time in a long while, the walls of our home felt like they were closing in. A wave of anxiety washed over me, something warm yet bitter stirring within. Jackson had left, and it felt as though something vital was departing with him. It was as if a tiny fissure in our marriage had begun to widen, slowly but surely. I glanced out the window and caught sight of my reflection, a 35-year-old woman, tired and somewhat adrift, yet still alive inside. In her eyes, I saw a yearning for something that seemed all but forgotten. In that moment, I realized I needed to rediscover myself, before I completely lost something precious in this monotonous routine. That was when I made the decision to stay. This choice would mark the beginning of changes I couldn't yet anticipate. The evening gradually enveloped the city, bathing the streets in a warm, golden glow. I sat in the kitchen, observing the long shadows cast by the trees, with distant voices drifting in through the open window. Though Jackson had only left a few hours ago, it felt as if days had passed. The house suddenly felt strange and unfamiliar without him. I picked up my phone, unsure why, and began scrolling through our photos, images of our time together, vacations, trips, smiling faces, and moments that once felt significant but had now turned into mere memories. Something stirred within me, like stale air escaping from an old trunk. It was a feeling I wanted to flee from. I set the phone down and walked to the kitchen, deciding to brew some tea. Yet even the simple task felt oddly hollow and pointless. I poured water into a cup when suddenly my phone buzzed. My heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it might be Jackson. But when I looked at the screen, it was Chloe's name. "Sophie, hi." Her voice was lively as ever, a little sparkly. I was just thinking about you. How are you? Everything's fine, Chloe, I replied, trying to inject some confidence into my tone. How about you? Great, she exclaimed, pausing as if carefully assessing my mood. Do you want to meet tonight? There's a place I'd love to take you. I hesitated, unsure of what I truly wanted. Inside me, two desires battled. One to hide under a blanket and forget everything, the other to escape the stifling emptiness. Yes, I finally replied. Tonight. You need to get out of the house, Sophie, she urged. Please don't say no. You look like you could really use some fresh air. Her words resonated with me. Chloe always had a knack for coaxing me out of my shell. With a sigh and a moment's contemplation, I replied, All right, let's do it. Where are we going? To a literary club downtown. They're hosting a poetry reading tonight. It's something different, and I think you'll really enjoy it. I rolled my eyes. A poetry reading seemed like the last place I wanted to be. But perhaps that was just what I needed. Something fresh. Something unpredictable. Fine, I conceded. When and where should we meet? In an hour at my place. I'll pick you up, Chloe said, her relief evident in her voice. You won't regret it, I promise. After hanging up, I felt my heart start to race. It was just an evening at a club, yet at that moment, it felt like I had committed to something far more significant. I started pacing around the room, mulling over what to wear and whether I was too worn out for an adventure like this. When I arrived at Chloe's house, she was already outside, beaming at me. As we climbed into her car and headed toward the city center, I couldn't help but notice how her eyes sparkled and how her energy was almost infectious. She was animatedly discussing a new poem she had recently read, but I struggled to concentrate on her words. My attention drifted to the streetlights, and I felt myself beginning to thaw, like ice melting under the sun's warmth. The club had a cozy atmosphere, with soft lighting and hushed voices creating an intimate space. It felt as if time had slowed down, leaving only poetry and thoughts lingering in the air. Chloe wasted no time leading me inside. She found a comfortable spot on a plush sofa and offered me a cup of tea. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted him. Oliver stood by the bar, engaged in conversation with another guest. His face lit up with a smile, and his eyes sparkled in the warm light of the lamps. Chloe, noticing where I was looking, smiled and said, There's the owner of this place. I've known him for years. Let me introduce you. I wanted to protest, but Chloe was already guiding me toward him, and my heart began to race. As we drew closer, he turned to face us, and his gaze landed on me. A genuine smile spread across his face, and his eyes glowed with something special. Chloe, he greeted cheerfully before turning to me. And who do we have here? This is my friend Sophie. Chloe introduced me. Sophie, this is Oliver. Nice to meet you, Sophie, he said, extending his hand. The moment our hands met, a slight shiver coursed through me, unexpected and inexplicable. His gaze held mine, and in that instant, there was something more than just a casual greeting. The world around us seemed to narrow, and for a brief moment, I forgot everything else happening around us. Nice to meet you too, Oliver, I replied, attempting to maintain my composure, though my heart was racing. I had no idea then that this evening would turn my world upside down. As the night unfolded at the club, I found myself becoming increasingly absorbed in this unusual yet captivating atmosphere. People around us were sharing their poems and feelings, and I hung onto every word, but my eyes kept drifting back to Oliver, who occasionally glanced my way from across the room. His presence filled the space with an energy I couldn't ignore. Chloe, noticing my distraction, smiled knowingly from her corner, as if she was aware of something I wasn't. As the evening began to wind down, Oliver approached us with 2 cups of coffee in hand. His smile was warm, but his gaze remained intensely focused. Did you enjoy it? He asked, looking directly at me. Yes, it was interesting, I replied, searching for the right words. My uncertainty was evident in my tone. I'm glad, he said, glancing at Chloe before adding, I think your friend could use some fresh air. Let's go. I'll show you something. Chloe nodded with such assurance that I didn't have the chance to object. Oliver took my hand, and we stepped outside the club. The air was cool, infused with the scent of rain and freshness. We wandered through the narrow streets as he shared his love for the city and the places that inspired him. At one point, we paused in front of a quaint coffee shop where, according to him, they served the best coffee in town. "This is where it all started for me," he said, smiling. "I opened this coffee shop back when I was a student. Poets, artists, musicians would gather here. There was something magical about it." I smiled back, noticing how his eyes lit up as he spoke about this place. Once inside, Oliver, familiar with every staff member, ordered 2 cappuccinos. When the drinks arrived, he studied me intently, as if trying to decipher my thoughts. "Sophie," he began softly, "you seem like someone who hasn't made time for herself in a long while. Am I right?" The question caught me off guard. His gaze felt penetrating, and I could feel my usual defenses crumbling. "Maybe," I admitted, lowering my eyes to my cup. "Sometimes it feels like life is just passing me by." He leaned closer, his face so near that I could feel his breath against my skin. "I feel the same way," he whispered, his voice suggesting a familiarity that felt almost intimate. "Isn't it fascinating how a single moment can change everything?" I lifted my eyes to meet his gaze, filled with warmth and something I couldn't quite articulate. The moment seemed to linger in the air, almost in slow motion. Unsure of how to respond, I was taken aback when he leaned in closer and softly kissed me. The kiss was brief, almost accidental, yet it brimmed with hidden passion and a touch of uncertainty. It felt as if he was testing the waters to see how I would react, and my response caught us both off guard. I didn't pull away. In that instant, I was swept up by an unfamiliar feeling that enveloped me, as if I were being drawn into another world, one I hadn't entered in a long time. When his lips finally left mine, I realized I had been holding my breath. We locked eyes, and I saw something in his gaze that was both enticing and intimidating. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, taking a step back. That was inappropriate, but I couldn't help myself. I shook my head in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. It was difficult to articulate my feelings, a blend of confusion, excitement, and fear. It felt unexpected and wrong, yet utterly irresistible. "It's all right," I finally managed to say, trying to regain my composure. "Really? It's all right?" He smiled, a bit sheepishly, and offered to walk me home. I agreed, uncertain about why I was saying yes. Inside, a storm of emotions surged that I couldn't quite grasp. That fleeting kiss had unlocked something deeply hidden within me, as if I had opened a door to an unexplored realm. When we arrived at my house, he paused and said, "Thank you for tonight, Sophie. I'm really glad we met." "Me too," I replied, noticing a subtle tremor in my voice. We exchanged goodbyes, and I watched him walk away, his figure gradually fading into the evening light. Once inside, I closed the door and felt a wave of emotions wash over me. That kiss, his words, his gaze, everything had been so unexpected and overwhelming. I had no idea what would come next. Yet, for the first time in ages, I felt truly alive. Days passed since that evening at the club, but I couldn't shake the memory of Oliver's brief kiss. The recollection was so vivid that I found myself constantly thinking about him, his gentle smile and warm words lingering in my mind. Something within me had shifted, like a small flame igniting in the darkness of my heart. However, I was still unsure how to handle this new feeling. I tried to concentrate on my daily tasks, gardening, grocery shopping, household chores. But every time I was alone, my thoughts drifted back to that moment when his lips brushed against mine. It felt as if that kiss had awakened something long buried beneath the monotony of my routine. The more I reflected on it, the stronger my urge became to see him again. One evening, Oliver called me. His voice was calm, but I detected a hint of excitement beneath the surface. "Sophie?" "Hi," he started, sounding a bit hesitant. "I've been thinking about you, and I'd love to see you again, if that's all right with you." "Of course," I replied, surprised at how easily and quickly I agreed. "Where and when?" "I have a place I'd like to show you," he said, a smile evident in his tone. "An old lighthouse on the coast, not far from here." The sunset views there are incredible. My heart raced at the thought. A lighthouse sounded romantic and almost surreal. I wasn't sure what to expect, but something about his invitation captivated me. "That sounds wonderful," I said. "Let's meet there." We set a time to meet, and I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. I chose a simple dress I adored for its lightness and freedom, trying to push aside the notion that this was a significant meeting. When I arrived at the lighthouse, Oliver was already waiting at its base, leaning against the railing. He looked relaxed, yet there was an underlying tension in his eyes, as if he was anticipating something important. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "It's great to see you." "I'm glad to see you too," I replied, smiling. We began our ascent up the narrow stone steps leading to the top of the lighthouse. As we climbed, Oliver shared stories about his life, explaining how this lighthouse symbolized more than just a location for him. He described how he often visited when he wanted to be alone with his thoughts, to feel free. When we reached the top, I was greeted by a breathtaking view of the sea. The sun was setting slowly over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The wind tousled my hair, and I felt something awaken inside me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Oliver asked softly, moving closer. His voice was nearly a whisper, yet I heard every note. "Yes, very," I replied, gazing at the horizon. "There's something special here." He turned to me, and I noticed his eyes radiating warmth and an emotion I couldn't quite place. He stepped forward and gently took my hand. "Sophie," he said softly, "I've been reflecting on what you mentioned that night about life passing by, and I realized it's not just about you, it's about me too." I remained silent, feeling his words resonate deeply within my heart. In that moment, I realized this man truly saw me. He recognized me for who I was, devoid of pretense or masks. "Do you know what's interesting?" he continued, stepping closer so I could feel his breath. "Sometimes we go through life without noticing the most significant moments, allowing them to slip right through our fingers." My heart raced again at his words. They resonated deeply within me. It felt like life was indeed passing me by, and here was this man who could see that truth. He leaned in even closer, his face so near that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Sometimes, we just need to take a step forward," he whispered just before his lips gently brushed against mine. This kiss was different, deeper and infused with emotion, as if he were pouring his entire soul into it. I responded instinctively, warmth blooming in my chest like a flower unfurling toward the sun. We stood at the top of the lighthouse, illuminated by the setting sun, and everything else around us faded away. This kiss was genuine and sincere, as if he were trying to communicate all the things words could never express. When we finally pulled apart, my head spun with a whirlwind of emotions. It felt both wrong and beautiful all at once. I knew this moment would change everything, and I could no longer deny my feelings. "I don't know what this means," I said, my breath coming in quick gasps, "but I feel like I can't pretend anymore." Oliver gazed at me with understanding. His eyes mirrored my own inner conflict. "And you don't have to," he replied softly. "Life is too short to waste on pretense." Wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the sounds of the wind and the waves, I realized my life was beginning to shift. I didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt alive and authentic. After that evening at the lighthouse, thoughts of Oliver consumed me. His words, his touch, his kiss kept me awake at night. Everything felt so genuine that I sensed a part of me reaching out to him with newfound strength. Yet a part of me resisted. I was still married to Jackson, the man I had spent a decade with, a man who had once meant everything to me. Jackson sensed my growing distance. He asked questions, reached for my hand at dinner, and looked into my eyes, trying to decipher what was happening. I could feel his escalating concern, his desperate attempts to reconnect with me. But every time I looked him in the eye, I was engulfed by guilt, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit that my heart was beginning to beat to a different rhythm. Chloe was there as always, noticing my turmoil and inviting me for a walk in the park. We wandered along paths blanketed in golden autumn leaves, and I finally decided to confide in her. "Something has changed, Chloe," I began, locking eyes with her attentive gaze. "I can't pretend everything is the same anymore. Something inside me is screaming, but I don't know what that voice is." She listened intently, nodding as I struggled to articulate my feelings. When I finished, she smiled gently and said, "You're just searching for yourself, Sophie. That's perfectly normal. We sometimes lose ourselves in routines and obligations, in the expectations of others. But how can I know what I truly want?" I sighed, feeling her words seep into my consciousness. That was the question I pondered every day, both in the morning and as night fell. That evening, I made a decision. I needed to see Oliver and have an honest conversation about what he felt and what our encounters meant. I could no longer remain in this suspended state where each day felt like both reality and a dream. I went to the club where we had first met. The place seemed almost empty, and the soft jazz music filled the air. Oliver stood at the bar, lost in thought. But when he spotted me, he immediately straightened up and smiled. "Sophie, you came," he said, and his voice carried that warm note I knew so well. "I need to talk to you," I replied, feeling a slight tremor in my voice. I wasn't sure how to initiate this conversation, but I knew I had to. "Of course," he said, gesturing for me to sit at a table in the corner, away from prying eyes. Once seated, he regarded me intently, his gaze studying my face, as if trying to read my thoughts before I even voiced them. "What's going on, Sophie?" he finally asked when the silence became unbearable. I took a deep breath and began. "Oliver, I don't know what's happening between us, but it feels more than just a casual acquaintance. I need to understand what you think about all of this, what you feel." He paused for a moment, his expression turning serious. "I feel something real for you, Sophie," he started. "But there's something I need to tell you." I froze, waiting for him to continue. Anxiety lingered in his voice, and my heart began to race. "The thing is, I recently got engaged," he said, looking directly into my eyes. "I never intended for our relationship to go this far. I didn't plan this, but now I can't ignore what I feel for you." His words hit me like a cold gust of wind. Everything around me seemed to darken, and I felt the ground slipping away beneath me. I was at a loss for words. I didn't know how to react. All my hopes and expectations crumbled in an instant, like I had plunged into an abyss with no way to stop my fall. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I whispered, unable to mask my confusion and pain. "I was afraid of losing you," he replied, his voice earnest, almost pleading. "I don't know what to do with this, Sophie, but I can't stop thinking about you." I stood up, feeling my legs tremble as if on the verge of collapse. I could no longer remain in this club where everything now felt fake and hollow. "I need time," I said, trying to keep my composure. "I need to figure out what to do next." Oliver didn't try to stop me. He simply nodded, his expression clouded with pain. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face sharply, reminding me of the harshness of reality. Everything inside me screamed with anguish and disappointment. I realized I was trapped between the past and the future, and now I had to find a path that led to freedom, even if it meant navigating through dark shadows.